Welcome back to Restore Gospel Podcast, where we're friends having casual conversation about the things of eternity, and we welcome you into that conversation. I'm excited. We're going to start a series, and Shane has put together some incredible slides and things we're going to be discussing. We're really blessed to all believe in the Book of Mormon and to not have been raised with prejudices against it. Recently, I talked to my pastor and was trying to share the Book of Mormon with him, and he said, well, there's just no evidence for it. And I think that these series of slides and podcasts are going to show that that's not true and that there is. Maybe some of you out there have wanted to share the Book of Mormon with others, and you've come up against some of these things, and maybe this will be helpful for you. But another thing is, I grew up trying to prove that the church in the Book of Mormon was real, but the real thing is the message of Jesus and of repentance contained in the Book of Mormon. And so as all of us, I think these things are faith strengthening. Hopefully it moves us to more and more engaged with the gospel contained in the Book of Mormon, and what a beautiful gift that it is. So that being said, we're going to turn this over to Shane.
All right. So this first slide is basically just kind of shows you kind of what we're going to talk about. This will be multiple weeks, but this gives you an idea where we're heading, and we may shift things as we go a little bit, add some stuff in, maybe take some stuff out. But this is kind of the overview. So the first thing I wanted to cover was the early beliefs regarding the Native Americans. So you think about it, they arrived on this continent in the Americas, and there's all these people here. And, they obviously have some structure in terms of their families and the way their society operates and all that. And so this sort of, caused the settlers and the pilgrims, everybody that has come over has kind of wondered, well, where do these people come from? And so in the early days, they looked at the people and they saw how similar they were to Hebrews. And so because they lived in tribes, they believed in one God, or the Great Spirit. They lived in tents. They were nomadic. They circumcised some of the tribes actually circumcised their children. They followed feast days. Now all these things didn't line up perfectly with the way the Hebrews did it, but there was just so many similarities. They had dietary rules. They knew how to make a covenant. They knew what covenants were. They used the number 7 and 12 in all their ordinances and their sacred rituals and stuff. And so you have all these things that parallel, and you're like wondering, well, how do these people do all these things if they've been across the ocean, from the beginning? How would they not? How would they know about these things? And so that caused a lot of speculation among early people. And so, one of the things growing up in the church that I've heard is, Ethan Smith, who wrote a book, The View of the Hebrews, in 1823. A lot of times people accuse Joseph Smith of having stolen his ideas. And so I wanted to show you that the idea that the Hebrews, or that a lost tribe of Israel was in America, way predates that time. And so Ethan Smith was just one of many who had this idea. So I wanted to show you a little history here. So in 1650, Menashe ben Israel, who was a Jewish rabbi in Amsterdam, he wrote a book called The Hope of Israel. And this was about the Native Americans in America. 1651, Thomas Thorogood wrote a book called Jews in America. 1683, William Penn, who's famous for being the founder of Pennsylvania, he made this statement. He said, "Their language is lofty yet narrow, but like Hebrew, in signification full, like shorthand in writing. One word serveth in the place of 3, and the rest are supplied by the understanding of the hearer, imperfect in their tenses, wanting in their moods and participles, adverbs, conjunctions, interjections. I have made it my business to understand it, that I might not want an interpreter on any occasion. And I must say that I know not a language spoken in Europe that hath words of more sweetness or greatness in accent and emphasis than theirs." And so you had these early settlers that they appreciated, and could see some similarities with the old world, but appreciated, the Native Americans and who they were at the time and what they could do. So in 1690, Cotton Mather was an English Puritan minister who believed that they were of the house of Israel. James Adair in 1775. Now, this is, 75, 80 years later. He writes this book called The History of the Native Americans. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But then in 1799, Bill Tabbitt, who was a Massachusetts pastor, he said this. He said, anyone conversant with the European Jews and the Aborigines of America will perceive a great likeness in color, features, hair, aptness to cunning, dispositions for roving, etc. 1803, Thomas Jefferson said, all the Indians of America are descended from the Jews. The same laws, usages, rites, and ceremonies, the same sacrifices, priests, prophets, fasts, and festivals, almost the same religion, and that they all spoke some Hebrew. 1823 then writes this book, Ethan Smith writes this book, The View of the Hebrews, which is what Joseph Smith was accused of using to write the Book of Mormon. And then 1837, Mordecai Emanuel Noah wrote Discourse on the Evidences of the American Indians being the Descendants of the Lost Tribes of Israel. And so you've got this long history, almost 200 years of this idea that the Native Americans were a lost tribe of the House of Israel. And so it wasn't anything new or weird that Joseph Smith, I always thought that Joseph Smith was like the first one to even suggest this idea. And he wasn't. I mean, the Book of Mormon stands on its own outside of this history. I guess in some ways it'd be kind of like if I did research and invented a cure for cancer using kale, no one would ever say that I invented kale. Just that I did the research and used it in this way. And so that's kind of the way I think of this. All right, so let me talk about this James Adair. So he's an interesting guy. He wrote that book in 1775. I'm going to talk about it in a second. But so he migrated from Ireland in 1735 to trade furs. He lived in North America for 40 years, cut off almost entirely from Europeans. So he was doing fur trading out with the Indians, living among them. He lived among the Chickasaw from 1744 to 1751. Then he moved to South Carolina in 1751. In the 1760s, he led a group of Chickasaw warriors fighting against the French. So he was trusted enough among the Chickasaw that he fought with them in a war against the French. Adair compiled all of his notes and journals to form a book, and that book he was totally convinced that the Native Americans were descendants of the Hebrews. This is a quote from him. He says, from the most accurate observations I could make in the long time I traded among the Indians of America, I was forced to believe them lineally descended from the tribes of Israel. 1775. And so this is what the book looks like. And he makes 17 points to support his idea. So he says they believed in one God. They worshipped a single deity, kind of like Hebrew monotheism. And the Indian name for God among this one tribe he was with was Yohevah, which is very similar to Jehovah. But that was the Indian word for God. They had tribal organization. The way they governed their tribes and stuff was very similar to the Israelites with the judges. They had purification rules. They had cleansing practices. Before they did any of their ceremonies, they went through these cleaning rituals. They had sacred feasts. These weren't all exactly set on the same feast days as the Jews, but the idea that you would use these feast days to celebrate certain things. And some of the tribes actually had 7 of them. That marriage customs around the rules around marriage and family resembled the Bible traditions. They had structures kind of like tabernacles where they had basically a church. They did circumcision. Some of the tribes did full out circumcision on their children. They had sacrificial offerings. They had certain leaders had roles like a priest. They had laws of clean and unclean, so certain foods were considered clean and certain were unclean. They avoided pork. They used Hebrew-like words. So Adair said that they used the words like Abba and Yehovah were used almost in the same way as they did in Hebrew. Their burial customs, the funeral rites, they bore resemblance to the Israelite traditions of burying your dead. They had fasting, and in the same way the Jews did it. They had oaths and covenants, so they understood the idea of how a covenant works and what it would be used for, and which you see that all through the Book of Mormon, how they're making covenants to each other. Well, that continued on into modern time. Cities of refuge. Some of the native settlements, they were like Israelite cities of refuge, where it was kind of a safe space. They had symbolic numbers, so they used the number 7 and number 12 in a lot of their rituals, which lined up well with the Hebrew numerology. And then the last one, the sacred fire. They used fire in their religious ceremonies, similar to biblical practices. And so if any one of these things, you could say, oh, well, that's just a coincidence, but these are 17, these are all big things. And having this many in this isolated location that had no contact, that we knew of, was kind of a big deal. So that brought us a little bit more into the modern time, where science and archaeology, didn't like this idea that they were Hebrews, or that and there's some reasons behind that.
Shane,
yeah.
Before we go into this, I just want to pause and give Mark a chance to say anything, or any of us. But it was interesting when he said, "I was forced to believe." And you think, like, people can say, "Well, we have a reason to show that the Native Americans were of Hebrew descent, because we believe in the Book of Mormon." But just take yourself back in time a little bit, and here's this early settler, and he's with these people, and he's just seeing these things come up with seemingly no prejudice or any inclination as to why he would want to believe that. He said, "I was forced to believe as I lived among them that there was just so many similarities that they had to have been, of some relation to the Hebrews." I thought that language was pretty neat. We go back in time, and then and you think about that and what that was like, how these things must have been really moving to him to see the contrast comparison.
Yeah, for sure. Mark, did you have anything, or?
No, nothing to add right now.
Okay.
Sounds great.
Okay. All right. So that so the shifting the ideas of America and who we are as a nation and all that began to shift from one of sort of escaping persecution of England to kind of being God's chosen people on this land, which I believe that we were, based on the Book of Mormon. But you can see how it sort of man kind of twisted it sort of in the wrong direction. So you have this idea of manifest destiny. So manifest destiny is like this idea that we are chosen to overtake this land. And so there was this belief among the Americans that everything west was ours. I mean, we had a right to it. We were sent here by God, and we were going to overtake it. And that meant walking over the Native American populations and taking the nation as ours all the way to the coast. And so the phrase was first coined in 1845 by John Sullivan. He said, "Our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions." And so they just believed that God had appointed us, I guess the white man or whatever, to own this land, to take it over, and by any means necessary. And so this is by quote by William Gilpin. He was a U.S. senator in 1846. He said, "Divine task, immortal mission. Let us tread fast and joyfully the open trail before us, with religious faith in the sublime and prodigious destiny of his well-loved country." Thomas Jefferson made a statement. He said, "An empire is only as strong as its border," which is fitting for today, I guess, but that's another discussion. And then George Bancroft, who was a historian, said, "It is the right of our manifest destiny to lead and to civilize the world. We are the chosen people, the exceptional nation." And then Theodore Roosevelt said, "We are a nation of pioneers, explorers, and conquerors. It is in our blood to seize new lands and forge a path to greatness." And and don't misunderstand me. I agree that this land is, one, the chosen land, two, that we were sent here, to do that. God used the Gentiles to bring judgment upon the house of Israel who had rejected him. The Lamanites had rejected the Savior. And so there is a divine action here. But the way we've gone about it is sometimes the issue, in terms of the violence and like the Trail of Tears, the displacement of the Native Americans, how they were treated, afterwards was not the love of Christ. And I think that has been a problem, but God is still using us to do that work, to just, to scatter the those that have rejected him, much like he used the Babylonians to scatter Israel. But the Babylonians didn't end well. And I think the Gentiles are going to have that same fate if we don't turn to Christ. But anyway, so you have this idea of manifest destiny. Well, then you also had the science world. And so, this was when evolution, all these kind of things were really getting big and just accepted as just, modern accepted thought. And so what these pictures are on the right is what they call the London hammer. And it was actually a rock that was discovered by a rural family in Texas with a stick sticking out of it, like a wooden post sticking out of the rock. And so the son saw it and thought it was really cool, and they brought it back to the house, and they'd had it there for a number of years. And then they decided at some point to break it open. And when they did, they find an iron hammer head inside the rock. So, no one knows how old it is. There's no way to date the metal. But the fact that it's inside of a rock, science would say, oh, that's a fraud. That could never happen. Rock could never form around a metal hammer. It takes millions of years. That's impossible. But yet here you have it, in plain sight that there's this rock and now there's a hammer inside of it. So our understanding of how rocks forms and how old the earth is and all that, don't match up to what science says. Science says it takes millions and millions of years. We know from the Bible that it doesn't. And so, we don't have to fully understand it. We can just trust God that this is how he said he made the earth in this amount of time. The picture on the left, same thing. You've got a giant sauropod footprint and a man's footprint in the same space. And Mike, this is that one we saw down in Glen Rose, Texas, at the Creation Museum.
Yeah, very cool.
So you've got this. You've got these, these things that should be separated by millions of years, and yet made this imprint nearly the same time, which turned into rock. And so these are things that science, they automatically say, well, this is a fraud. Because
right.
It's got to be, because it doesn't fit the narrative. And so the same thing has happened, what's happened in the biblical world has also happened with the Book of Mormon. And so this is the Smithsonian are some of the most egregious in this process. This guy's name's John Wesley Powell. He was the head of the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian Institute. And so he believed in an isolationist doctrine, which meant that you can't take old world culture and mix it with American culture, with the Native Americans. He basically said they were always separated. They'd never been connected. They never came from the same place. Anything that you find in their language or in their artifacts or whatever is just purely a lucky, just coincidence. Couldn't be they had any contact. It's impossible. Anything that shows they had contact is automatically a fraud. I mean, we don't even have to put it under a microscope. We already know it's a fraud. And so because of that, you had settlers like tearing down the Indian mounds along the East Coast and finding all kinds of artifacts, all kinds of things made out of copper and, all kinds of interesting things. But whenever they were brought forward, they were immediately accused of being fraudulent because it didn't match the doctrine of what the leading scientists of the day were saying. And so in 1880, he wrote an essay, said it was illegitimate to connect American artifacts with ancient peoples from other continents. And so that became the standard of all science. And any scientist that tried to come out and say, hey, I think this might be real, was just laughed out of the room because, the Smithsonian said that's impossible. And so that, it's kind of like peer pressure, in a echo chamber, where this has got to be the way it is because this is what we believe. And they do the same with evolution and other things. And so one of their cover-ups that was the most egregious, and I think a lot of people probably know about this, but there's this stone that was found in Bat Creek, Tennessee. So in 1889, the Smithsonian themselves did an excavation of one of the Indian mounds, and they found this stone and it had writing on it, and they believed it to be Paleo Cherokee, and so they were excited. They thought, "Wow, we found some Cherokee writing. Let's hang it in the museum." So they put it in the museum, and it sat there until the 1960s. And in 1960s, Henriette Mertz and Cyrus Gordon looked at this, and these guys had been studying Paleo Hebrew that went back to pre Babylonian period, and they're seeing characters that they recognized. The problem was they had it displayed upside down. So they went to the Smithsonian and they said, "Hey, this needs to be turned over. These characters are perfect Paleo Hebrew." And so what it reads is for the Judeans, and part of it's broken off. You can see on the left side that there's characters missing. Hebrew, reads from right to left. But anyway, there was parts missing, and so, but it was perfect, perfect Hebrew, from way before from the time of Christ, basically. And so the Smithsonian, because it went against their doctrine, said, "Oh, well, then this thing was a fraud." Even though they're the ones that did the excavation, and it was in their museum all this time until the 1960s, because someone proved that, hey, this is actually Hebrew writing, then they immediately dismissed it. And it got sold off. They declared it as a fake, and it ended up in another museum. I can't remember which museum it's in, but you can see it today. But the artifact was re-inspected in 1988, and they actually found some microscopic wood fragments in the text that dated it to 32 AD. And so that's the question: how would that get here? Unless people migrated, unless people came here, unless people were here already and spoke Hebrew or writing in Hebrew, or at least a version of Hebrew. I mean, it would have changed because what they wrote the plates in was Reformed Egyptian, which was a Hebrew Egyptian kind of mix, and then the language they spoke was Hebrew, but it would have over time would have shifted so that everything wouldn't have been exactly the same, but obviously a Hebrew foundation. And so how do you explain that? The Book of Mormon does explain that. Science can't, other than just saying it's a fake.
That's the first picture I've seen with that hand, giving it an idea of how big. I guess I always thought it was this big tablet that was bigger.
Yeah.
That's neat having that hand there to give you some perspective.
Yeah, that's why I stuck it in, because I had no idea it was that little either. I'd never seen it in person.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so the next thing we come to is plates. So when Joseph Smith, said that he had these gold plates and that God had given him this ability to translate them, it was a laughing stock. It was just totally unheard of, kind of ridiculous. And here's some statements that were made. Eber D. Howe in the book Mormonism Unveiled, 34, he said, "The absurdity of engraving a book, several hundred pages on plates of gold and then hiding them in the earth is too glaring to require comment," which I see "two" is spelled wrong. That's interesting. But anyway, to require comment. And then Alexander Campbell in 1831 said, "The ignorance of Smith is equaled only by the credulity of his followers. Who ever heard of sacred records kept on plates of gold?" So when he brings this out, in 1829, 1830, and he says, "I got this off these gold plates that God gave me," that just was stupid. I mean, nobody had ever even heard of that. And so now going forward in time, we've got some examples because we have the advantage of being able to look backwards. So this is the Laguna copper plate inscription. It was discovered in 1989 in the Philippines while dredging some sand in a river. It's written in Indonesian Kavi, and it contains a date of 822 AD. Okay, so not Book of Mormon time and not in Hebrew. I mean, but it does show that ancient people wrote on metal. So let's go back a little further into history. So the anvil plates in 300 AD, they were found in Nagpur district of India in 1905. Then you've got the copper scroll, Qumran Cave 3 of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This was found in 1952. This is actually Hebrew, written on these metal, copper plating. It was originally rolled up in a scroll. And what's interesting is what's on there is kind of a treasure map. It tells you where all these things are, these sacred objects are all buried. A lot of times, a lot of people believe that it came from about the Bar Kokhba revolt, where they scattered out of Israel, and they may have made a record of where they put artifacts. So there's lots of treasure hunters that are eagerly studying this, trying to figure out where some of this stuff was hidden. But this was found in 1952. It dates back to about 50 AD. Then you've got this one here. This is from 2700 BC. It's in Sumer. It's found in Iraq. It was found in 1937, and today it's in the Louvre. Then you got the Etruscan Gold Book. It dates back to 660 BC. It was discovered in Bulgaria in 1955. It's made of 23.82 carats gold with 6 pages. It's currently displayed in the National Historical Museum in Sofia, Bulgaria.
Shane, that's crazy. Because I don't know if Mark, you ever had people push back on the Book of Mormon. That was one of the biggest things was, gold plates, there's no way and it was almost like people would bring up that argument and there was no need to go any further because then the whole thing's a wash and just a big lie. But I mean, to see these things in all these different cultures, it's just so obviously a fallacy to even use that as an argument, and I still hear those new things today, right?
That's the sad part is people still quote those old things and they don't know that they've been totally debunked.
I just saw atheist who's very popular. He's been on a lot of popular podcasts that he just released a thing about Mormonism because of the gold plates and what a fallacy that is. And it just seems so intellectually dishonest in today's age to even use that as an argument when there's so many proofs that other ancient cultures were doing the same thing. And here, that Egyptian here was gold plates. What'd you say? 23 karat gold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they were too heavy for Joseph to carry around, and it would be impossible. And that's been debunked as well.
Yeah. Of course, to be fair, that was only, I think, 6 pages, so I mean, whole book, I'm sure the Book of Mormon wasn't in that pure gold, but
you can see that even some of these metals, if they're thin enough to even be wrapped up in a scroll, that we're not talking about thick wedges of gold, but they had the technology to make them very, very thin enough to be inscribed, but also, to make it's not going to be 600 pounds.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, and gold is one of the few things that will last. I mean, it's soft and it lasts, and it can be underwater for 2,000 years and not be ruined. It's like the only metal that you could do that with.
Wow.
So, all right. So here's another one. This is the Persian Golden Codex. It was found in 2005 in Iran. It was written in cuneiform script, and it dates to 550 BC. And then you've got the Pyrgi gold tablets. They date to 500 BC. They were discovered in 1964 in Pyrgi, Italy. They're written in Etruscan and Phoenician, which Phoenician is a Semitic language, so it's connected to Hebrew. So a lot of the characters are real similar to the Paleo-Hebrew. It's currently on display at the National Etruscan Museum in Rome. And I just found this one a couple days ago. This is the Ketef Hinnom Silver Scrolls. So this is kind of interesting. This dates to 600 BC. These are tiny little scrolls. They are written on silver. And they were found in 1979 by Tel Aviv University in Cave 24 at Ketef Hinnom, which is an archaeological dig site. They are the oldest surviving text from the Hebrew Bible. So older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're the oldest thing we have that has biblical words on it. They're written in Paleo-Hebrew, and which Paleo-Hebrew is the Hebrew from before the Babylonian conquest. So it's probably what Lehi would have written in. and this contains a priestly blessing that's found in Numbers 6, 24 to 26. And what it was originally it was rolled up and it was used like an amulet. So you'd write this, they wrote this blessing, like a spiritual blessing on this little scroll. They rolled it up and then they would wear it, kind of like a charm necklace or, some kind of a little amulet. And then this one's really cool. This one is called the Plaque of Darius. It's from Persia. It dates to 518 BC, so it was just after the Babylonian conquest. And it was found in Iran in 1933. But even more interesting, so this basically talks about, Darius and his conquest and different things. But what's really fascinating is not only is it written on these gold plates, but it was found in a concrete or in a stone box. So that's all I had on plates. Did you guys have any comments?
You got anything, Mark?
No, and I don't want to go back, but probably close to 40 years ago, there's a big mound in Newark, Ohio, a circle mound. I mean, huge, and they had a little museum there, and I went, and they had this stone that they had excavated that was written the Ten Commandments in Hebrew, and 22 decades later, I took a net to see it, and it wasn't in the little museum. And there was this elderly lady there, so she had been, volunteering there for a long time, and it just was providence. She was there that day, and I said, I was here many years ago, and I found this. I saw this stone, and it was so interesting. It was written in Hebrew, and she said, yeah, I was here then. She said, the Ohio Historical Society has taken that out of here and labeled it as a fraud. And so it was just a real life experience for me of this same thing, this manifest destiny, this still going on in our time, in the last 20, 30 years. So anyway, just thought I'd throw that in.
Yeah.
So not to bash on the scientific community, but we see these things through the years in school and how our kids are taught, and very secular science, likes to go the secular route and kind of push God aside. And so you wonder why people listen to these things. Oh, it was declared a fraud. But it's the same spirit behind those minds that declare things a fraud that is run amok in America, as we see. Let's just push God out of everything, or this idea of his plan and his covenant people. And it's no different there. So when you're talking to people, it's interesting what they choose to pick and believe. And yet here, look at this box with that gold or that metal plate in it. I mean, how similar is that to the story that Joseph, found that rock and pulled the dirt away and lifted the lid, and the plates were in a metal stone box? It looks probably similar to this right here. Absolutely amazing to me. That and also sad that people are so willing to believe or choose what information they want to believe when there's so much evidence here that things probably that weren't available to him. If the thought is that this was all made up and a thing of man to deceive people, this information wasn't out there. So man, it's like he hit every single mark then in his story, right, of the Book of Mormon. The gold plates and in a stone box and everything.
Yeah. All right. Well, keep going.
Sure.
All right. So let's talk about some of the old world archaeology. So one of the early arguments about Joseph Smith was that, the Book of Mormon story itself said that they left Jerusalem and they traveled all this distance, and for 8 years they were in the wilderness. And, a lot of people were like, well, that's just dumb. They'd be in the desert. It'd be dangerous. There's no way that any of this happened. There's no way they could have taken a ship that kind of distance, or even, especially people that didn't even know how to build a ship. I mean, the whole thing just sounded fantastical. And so, there needs to be a logical explanation as to how they could have made this journey. And so, if you read the text, it actually tells you pretty clearly where it went. It's probably better geography in the old world than it is in the new. It says that they went a 3-day journey to a place called Shazer, and there was a place there there was water access. You have the Valley of Lemuel and the River Laman, and then they said they went by the borders of the Red Sea. Well, we know where the Red Sea is, and so this map I have up is kind of the proposed route. And of course, this is all just proposed. We don't know for sure, but the description fits. And so, they traveled southeast in a southeast direction along the Red Sea. And it says that when they got to this place, it was called Nahum. They turned due east and went straight east from there. Well, if you lay that on a map of Saudi Arabia, it's actually pretty fascinating. So Nahum was one of the places that in the book, so every place that they went to, they named it except for Nahum. So it says, like, when we came to this we called it Bountiful. When we came to this valley, we called the Valley of Lemuel. They named these places that they came to because they'd never been there before. They didn't know what it was. So they just gave it a name. But Nahum, it says that it was called Nahum. So it was like the wording basically sounds like it already had that name. They didn't name it that. And so if you do some old world history, you'll find that the route they took was actually the old frankincense route. So frankincense was grown on the southern part of Saudi Arabia and was brought up along the Red Sea, right along that route where you see the dotted lines. That was the old frankincense route to get it up to the Mediterranean, and then from there it'd go all over the place. And it was dangerous. There was robbers there. It was a scary place to be because there was a lot of money, a lot of wealth that went along that route. But it was populated. It wasn't like it was just empty, open desert. I mean, there were people there, which makes a lot of sense when you read the story of the Book of Mormon, because they were told not to use fire. So they were not allowed to use fire. God told them, don't light any fires, and eat your meat raw. And God, it says that God made the meat like sweet, so that it was edible and they could do it. And so they ate raw meat for 8 years across this journey, not lighting any fires. And that makes sense. They wouldn't, because you light a fire and you just told everybody around you where you are, and there was tons of robbers and thieves, and, it was treacherous. And so God preserved them on that journey by telling them how to travel. And when they got to Nahum, that is where Ishmael died. And so it's interesting. The word Nahum actually means to mourn. But, in Hebrew, they don't use vowels in the ancient Hebrew. Vowels were added later just to help pronounce. But when you're talking about a name of a place called Nahum, Joseph Smith, God would have given him the vowels to write so that we'd know how to pronounce it or how to say it. But it was actually originally would have been just NHM, just those letters, the consonants. And so it's interesting, if you look, they've actually found 3 stelas at that location that have the name NHM. It was called Nahum in ancient times. And that wasn't on any maps that Joseph Smith would have had access to. That wasn't anything he would have had any knowledge of. And yet here you have archaeological evidence, markers in these cities, in this ancient city right now today, that have the word Nahum on it. And so this would have been the route, the proposed route. Of course, we don't know how they went ocean-wise. This is what makes a lot of sense. We know that Oman was where Bountiful would have been. And it's interesting too. Let me grab my pointer. Hold on a second. Okay, so, all right. So right here, this area of the southern part of Saudi Arabia, it's mostly all arid and dry, except for right where the yellow line is. There's one little area, and it's in Oman, and it's a small little section where it's real lush and tropical, and that's where they grew the frankincense, was in that area. But that would have been a perfect location for Bountiful because it had everything they needed. It had copper, it had trees big enough to build a ship out of. It was like an oasis, and it's one of the few. If you look at a like a Google Maps view of it, you don't see a lot of green other than in that one little area, which is interesting. So they traveled down what we believe to be the coast of Africa, and then they went around the Horn and then up. And the natural ocean currents would have taken them into like the Florida, in this area of the U.S., both Central and, Central America and all that area there. Well, so science just laughed that off. So, no, that's just ridiculous. Nobody could ever make that journey in ancient boats. They didn't happen. It was made up. That's just stupid. Well, actually, science again is wrong. But before I do that, I want to give a quote here. So there was a documentary done by the History Channel. It's called "Who Really Discovered America," and where they said, "I don't think there is a question of ships making it. A vessel can make it with dead people." So basically, this Dr. James Delgado, who's an maritime archaeologist, basically said the journey would have taken way too long. There's no way that anybody could make it. And what he's referring to is not the Book of Mormon. What he's referring to is Herodotus, who was a historian, made the claim that ancient Phoenicians were, a Semitic people from the northern tribes of Israel. The Phoenicians had traveled down through in that same route, through Saudi Arabia. They came through this area right outside of Israel, and then came down the Red Sea and traveled this route around Africa. And he made the claim they went around the Horn of Africa and came back into the Mediterranean to do trading over on this side, and did stuff here in northern Africa. Well, everybody said, "Oh, that's impossible. That's absolutely impossible." And so that was what they were actually referring to on that special, not the Book of Mormon route. But interestingly enough, they decided to try it. So they built a replica of a ship that they excavated this ship. It's a Phoenician ship. They excavated it and then rebuilt an exact copy using the way they would have constructed it, using the same old methods. Built an exact copy, and this is a ship that would have been a normal Phoenician ship back in the 600 BC range. So right about the time that Lehi would have traveled, because that's when Herodotus said they were traveling around the Horn of Africa and up around. And so in 2008, they built this ship and they made the journey. It took 2 years and 2 months. And then they took another trip in September of 2019 from Tunisia, which is in northern Africa, and they sailed it to Florida. And so you've got this example. Now, keep in mind, Nephi said the ship they built, that God showed him how to build, was not like any ship that they had been made during that day. So this wasn't what Nephi's ship looked like, but this was a ship from the same era as Nephi that made that journey. This is the actual trip that they made with the Phoenicia. There's the dates and everything. It took 74 days. And what's interesting is the ocean currents actually began to kind of suck them towards America. And when they got about 400 miles off the coast of the United States, they ended up having to do an adjustment and get their sails fixed and get it heading back the other direction to take them back towards the original route. So they weren't trying to come to America, but the water was like pulling them towards America. So, this just shows that the possibility of that journey with ancient, knowledge was certainly within the possibility. So any comments on that?
I don't. I'm just trying to soak it all in. That's crazy that if they hadn't made that adjustment, I mean, look where they would have continued on, right? 400 miles off the coast.
Yep. All right. So Hebrew writing in America. So there are lots of examples of Hebrew writing. Of course, they've mostly all been, claimed to be a fraud. This is an interesting one. So I don't know if you guys know what this is, but what do you think this looks like? If somebody was to show you this picture and say, "Hey, what's this?" What would you say it is? What does it look like?
I think it's an oil lamp and a menorah.
Exactly. Menorah. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You got a menorah here on the inside. You got an oil lamp here. Very Jewish looking. And what this actually is Indian mounds. This was discovered. So back in the 1800s, the Smithsonian, which is funny, it's the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian, they sent out two guys, Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis, to look at the mounds, to basically draw pictures of them, measure them, get a good survey of all the Indian mounds, because they were everywhere. They covered Ohio, and I mean all that. A lot of the eastern side of the United States was covered in these mounds, and they were from the Hopewell Indians, which was a tribe. That's what they call them, but that was a tribe that fits exactly the period of the Nephites. And so this was all in the Mississippi Valley, and these guys went and basically did drawings. So what you're seeing here is many, many, many acres big, and this thing is huge. And you had these little gaps in the walls, but they're basically big earthen mounds that go all the way around. And for whatever reason, it's shaped like a oil lamp and a menorah. I don't know if that was intentional to show their Hebrew background, but that's what they look like. But anyway, not only do they look like that, but they fit the description found in the Book of Mormon of how they built their fortifications. So when they first found these mounds, they thought they were burial mounds. They thought they were some kind of ceremonial burial mounds. But then when they started digging them up, they didn't find a lot of bodies. They didn't find a lot of bones. They found a lot of artifacts, Indian arrowheads and spears and all kinds of stuff, but not so many bodies. But they also found post holes. So all along the way, they would find these areas where a tree or a post had been buried in the ground. And so they started kind of reevaluating what these were. And what they've determined is that most of these were fortifications. So the earth was dug up and created these mounds in the shape of this edifice. And then on top of those mounds, they would stick wood in the top to make a wall, basically like a fort. And so that's how they believed that they would have looked in the past. And so look what we've got in the Book of Mormon. So Alma says, "And now behold, the Lamanites could not get into their forts of security by any other way save by the entrance, because the highness of the bank which had been thrown up, and the depth of the ditch which had been dug round about, save it were by the entrance." So they dug up these ditches, mounted up the land, and then put the posts in them, and they had these places of entrance, is what they called them, where they had like a gap where you could get in and out. It was easier to defend a small gap than to have the whole thing accessible. And so this is actually a really elaborate one. You've got others. These are some other ones from today. So here, these were massive. Some of these were many, many acres big, where the whole thing was like a whole city all inside of a. Now this is a AI or a computer animation of one, but this is an actual one here. You can see this mound goes all the way around, and it makes a big, huge circle. And they would have had posts all along here, and it would have been like a fort. And the ditch probably would have been a lot deeper. You have erosion, and so everything has kind of settled down over time. But this would have been a lot deeper and a lot higher wall. But that was how they built their forts, and that's exactly how the Book of Mormon says that their forts were built. Here's another one. This is in Newark, the Newark earthworks. So they've got this gigantic circle, goes all the way around, and looking at some scale, you can see these are houses. I mean, this thing was huge. And then you've got this gap where there's no wall. This would have been the place of entrance. So if you can imagine this with no trees, and imagine, wood poles all along here creating a wall, a wooden wall all the way around, and then a gap where it could be defended. That was how the Nephites and Lamanites, how they built their cities.
And that's precisely the place where I was talking about earlier. And that little building up there is, I believe, the museum. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And so science covers it up. Science calls them, just says, oh, they're burial mounds, or they're, they're like, they've kind of got away from the burial part. They've shifted more towards they were into like serpent worship. So they built these things to look like serpents, stuff like that. But, it's still, you still can't deny the fact that they have found the wooden posts of all these walls around. I mean, they don't know what they are, but we do, because the Book of Mormon says what they were for. All right, so this is that Back Creek stone we talked about, and I won't talk about it a lot, but it look at my notes real quick. I pretty much already told you guys about it, but yeah, so they did carbon. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna. So Matt or Mark, that little building there that you said was they had a copy of the 10 Commandments in Hebrew,
right?
And then later on decided to just make that disappear. But you actually saw it.
I actually saw it years ago.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah. All right, so this is an interesting one. So I did some research, and I took a map and basically said, okay, where are all the places in the whole, North and South America, where are all the places where any Hebrew writing has been found? Now, whether or not they're fake or real, I just any place where purported findings of Hebrew have been found. And I found it really interesting. So here's what I found. In 1848, and I'll just let this run so you can see all the places and the dates.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's pretty impactful when you think about it. Now, some of these may have been fakes, we don't know, but the fact that these artifacts have been pulled out of the ground over 100-year period, in all over the whole, northern, southern parts of the Americas, is I find really fascinating. Somebody have something?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you've ever looked at it, but I think when Squire and Davis were doing their thing, I'm trying to remember, but it seems like there were over 10,000 Indian mounds in America. I mean, most of them have been plowed under by farmers and so on and so forth. There's still many that exist here in Ohio. But I saw a map once where they put dots, and it was just phenomenal, for the manifest destiny thing that these people were savages. Just doesn't fly. It's just so amazing when you look at how this encompassed so much of the United States, these mounds.
I use that word savages. Shane, you remember that book by one of the early men in the Restoration, the way they looked at the Native Americans? Didn't they use the word savages? What was it called?
They called him the Red Man. It was I can't think of his name offhand, but yeah, he wrote a book. I think it was called the Red Man's Trials or something like that. But yeah, I read the book, and it kind of refers to him as savages, and it's funny because he's talking about having compassion on them and trying to bring them to the church, but yet in the same sentence, he's basically very condescending about who they are, and just kind of treating them like they're just dumb,
Right, and to just bulldoze over, all of these relics and things, and put up concrete and buildings, and not even preserve it. And like Mark said, that map with all of those mounds and everything, just thinking about how many have been lost and in the name of progress, and how quickly America was built up, in just a couple hundred years. Look at this country from a vast, wilderness to interstate highways. And I mean, it's been very quick, really, from the early 1800s until now. And when you have the impetus to make it look like manifest destiny, and these are just a bunch of savages, and some of those quotes you showed earlier, in the name of progress, this is our job to build this up. We've been a chosen people, and going along with the prophecy in the Book of Mormon that they'd be spread about and run down by the Gentiles. It just all fits together. It takes a lot of faith to try to deny it, I think, rather than just to see the evidence that's present.
Well, and you had to, to appease people, you had to kind of prove that these people were totally savage. They had no culture. They had no,
right.
To justify, we're going to make things better. I've studied this stuff years ago, and I don't want to say wrong things, but there's a set of mounds and at least evidence where they were in Newark and Heath, Ohio, which is in a road that kind of pointed out of there to mounds down in Chillicothe, Ohio, which is probably 40 or 50 miles away. And that this road that left Newark Heath area comes directly into this road that leaves Chillicothe. And I don't even understand how these people could build something and point it to something that far away with no airplanes and no satellites. And it's phenomenal. And just all the mounds that tie into equinoxes and different, settings of the sun and this stuff. So really, really a highly cultured people that the United States government decided we've just got to squelch all that in order to do what we want to do.
Yeah, so you look at these yellow dots and you think this is just the things that have survived, right?
Yeah, right.
And how many more are probably out there or have been out there or have been just taken and been lost?
Well, and this is just Hebrew writing. This is not like other artifacts and mounds and all that. This is just the Hebrew letters found on, cave walls or, artifacts. So
very cool.
All right, so this is called the Newark Keystone. It's written in Hebrew. Now some have called it a fraud, a fake. Now the Hebrew is a little bit more of a modern Hebrew, so it may very well be. I just threw it in because it's one of the artifacts that's often mentioned. But it says holy on one side. It says Holy of Holies. On another, it says King of the Earth. Another one, it says the Law of God, and the other one says the Word of God. And it was found in June of 1860. And then this is another really interesting one. This is the Newark Decalogue Stone. So this was found in November of 1860. It was this basically this box is made of sandstone, and this little figurine was found inside the box, and the box was closed when they dug it up. But the figure is made out of limestone, so it's hard limestone, and the box is made out of sandstone, which is softer and easier to carve. A geologist by the name of Dave Hawkins and Ken Bork of Denison University, they did some work on this and identified the types of stone and all that. But what's interesting is that there's Hebrew text all around the outside of this thing. I think I might have a better, yeah. So this is Hebrew writing all the way around the outside, and it also is written on the side of it. The edges have it as well. You can see it there, and it actually has it's a condensed version of the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, that's the stone I saw 40 years ago.
Okay, yeah,
amazing.
Yeah,
Wow.
It's labeled as a fake, and they I think it actually is now being shown again, but in the museum. But there's like a thing on the like a disclaimer or whatever that says hey, this has been reported to be a fake, but here's what was brought forward in 1860. But anyway, it has the Ten Commandments, and then above the character is the name of Moses written in Hebrew. And so you've got Moses, he's got the Ten Commandments all around him, and then it's put in this decorative little box for safekeeping. It was actually originally translated incorrectly. They thought it said Mashiach, which is like Messiah, But then later, more people that are more expert looked at it and said, no, that's actually Moses, not Messiah. Um, and then in 2014, Bradley Lepper of the Ohio History Connection found a fragment of wood. So when they pulled it out of the ground, the Peabody Museum of Natural History had some of the, I guess it was like a wooden understructure that it was sitting on or connected to. And so they found that they still had some of this wood. It was part of the burial platform that they had. And so they decided to test it. And it tested to 135 AD. And it was made out of an oak tree that was originally 2 foot in diameter. And so the box could have actually been even older than the wood they found it in. But, this is not something you can fake. I mean, you can call it a fake all day long because you don't believe, but, the date, the carbon dating on the wood pretty much tells you, how old this thing was. But it would have been in the time of the Hopewell culture, which was, and they're the ones that would have constructed the mound. It was in a burial mound when they pulled it out. So,
it's interesting too, from like 34, 35 AD through 200 AD was the pinnacle of the Nephite civilization. After Christ had come and things were good until about 200 years AD.
Yeah. So that would have been built maybe by people that their parents had seen Christ, All right, so this is the Los Lunas Decalogue stone. This was discovered in 1880, but it wasn't documented officially until 1933 by an archaeologist named Frank Hibben. It had a bunch of lichen and little growth stuff like moss and all that kind of grown over, so they had to kind of peel it away to sort of see it all. And its age is debated. So this one's a tough one. There's a lot of debate about this one. It's the ranges are between 500 to 2,000 years old, but it's pre-Columbian for sure. It's a 9-lined abridged version of Exodus 20. And sadly enough, if you see this kind of white area, it was some vandals scratched out the first line of it because it's just out in the open. So people walked up to it and did some damage to it. You can see some other graffiti over here, but the actual letters are the rest of it's still intact, and you can still see it. Now when you go, you have to like register and I don't know, give your copy of your driver's license, and kind of like if it ends up damaged, they'll know it was you.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say my family's from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and later on moved to Belen. And as you drive down from Albuquerque towards Belen, I remember just as a young kid or younger, my grandma had some newspaper clippings about the Los Lunas stone, and I want to say it's kind of up on a plateau, maybe. Shane, I don't know if you know that, but I remember them talking about that, decades ago, and it was fascinating to me that the 10 Commandments had been found in Hebrew right there in New Mexico.
Yeah, it's hard to get to. I don't know if it's up on a ledge, but it is really hard to get back in there to it. So, and a lot of modern scholars call it a hoax. I mean, they go through and they say, "Oh, this letter wasn't formed this way during this time period," and "Oh, this idiot got it wrong" or whatever. But then you have other people like Cyrus Gordon, who is a respected linguist, said he believed it was real and that it was a Samaritan mezuzah. And what a mezuzah is Jewish people would take a small little thing like a piece of stone or wood, and they would inscribe a scripture verse on it and put it in the entryway of their house. I don't know if you've watched The Chosen. They'll kiss the doorway of the house when they walk in and out. Well, a lot of times there's a little wooden block there, and it's got letters on it that are like a Hebrew scripture. And so it's like a way of just saying, bless this house, Well, the Samaritans were known for not so much doing that on the little one on the house. They'd put a big old like stone that was carved in the front, out like in front of their property, out in front of their house. And so that's what made him think that maybe it was a Samaritan, which would have been Northern Kingdom type of artifact. So, But it's huge. It's part of the mountain. It can't get moved, and time is taking its toll on it. And it may or may not be real, but the evidence is pretty good for it. So
Have they done something to highlight that color? I mean, to like stencil it? It doesn't seem possible it could be that brilliant after 500 or 2,000 years.
Yeah, I don't know. And people might have been, going over it with stones, because obviously people have had some time to mess around and vandalize it. So it's hard to say.
Yeah,
it's a shame.
I was going to say, so I'd like to keep these episodes to about an hour, and we're a little past an hour right now, but I don't know if there's a good place to break or not.
Yeah, I'm getting close. Let me finish up this little archaeology section, and we'll cut it there. All right. And so there are let me check something real quick here. Okay. So there are some Native American words that fit very well with ancient Hebrew. So if you look on your left, the column shows the English word, and then what the word is interpreted into a Native American language, and then what the word is interpreted into Hebrew. And so you can see how many of these are the same. Yehovah and Jehovah, Ale, Ya, Ja. And there's really close comparison. The word Abba is exactly the same, means father. Ishto is woman. Awa or Ewa, it means wife. And so these are all things that, you can't really argue this because it's their language. But how would you have so many sounds meaning the exact same thing if there was no contact, through time? And then one other thing I want to touch on before we end it is the Micmac Indians. So the Micmac are really fascinating. The word Micmac means something hidden. The tribe was located north of Cumorah, north of the hill Cumorah in New York, and up into Canada, kind of in that northern, near the Great Lakes area. They have a very high concentration of Middle Eastern DNA. When the DNA studies, and I'll talk about that probably next time, but when the DNA studies first came out, they said, they tested the Mayan Indians of Central America, and they said, there's no DNA at all of Central America or of Eastern Asian or Western Asian, like Middle East DNA. That doesn't exist. Well, they didn't test the Micmac tribe up in southern Canada, and they actually have a very high concentration of Middle Eastern DNA. They have a Hebrew custom of a 1-year betrothal and a dowry to get married, which correlates with the Hebrews. They have a belief in a great flood. They believe that they descended from one man and one woman. They believe their people sailed there via a great ocean. They believe that a man visited them and performed miracles, and the people were healed of all their sicknesses. The man stayed for multiple weeks teaching and healing the people. The man came after a period of extreme devastation and destruction, followed by 3 days of sleep. Now, of course, their custom says sleep, but it could also mean darkness. Their language contains many Hebrew words and characteristics. And there was a French Catholic missionary named Father Christian Leclerc in 1691, and he lived among them and did missionary work among them. And he said this, he said, these people had received in times past a knowledge of the gospel and of Christianity, which they have finally lost through the negligence and licentiousness of their ancestors. So here you have a Catholic priest saying that in 1691 that these Native Americans that he's ministering to at some point have heard about Christianity, but have lost it through sin. I mean, how amazing is that?
Complete correlation with the story in the Book of Mormon.
Yep. And so the Micmac language their writing is much more Egyptian styled than you see in Hebrew, than a Hebrew style. And so in ancient Egyptian, this is the word how you'd write good in hieroglyphics. In Micmac, it's holy. Star is the same. All is similar. Ancient high place or to ascend, and this means God in Micmac. And then you've got other correlations as well. In fact, some of the writing on the characters document matches up really well with the Micmac language. And then, interesting enough, this is the location of the Micmac tribe. You look at all the tribes in the Americas, it's right there, just north of where, right here is where is the New York where the plates were, and it's just up to the north of it a bit. So anyway, all the tribes in this area have incredible legends and stories that all tie into the Book of Mormon. The Iroquois have a belief of that they buried all their weapons of war under a tree and decided they would fight no more. You've got these parallels to the Book of Mormon that are just fascinating. And then, so just a few more things. This will be the last slide. So the other tribe. Now, keep in mind, Native Americans didn't just stay in one place for 1,000 years or whatever. They move around. They're nomadic. They follow the game. They would be escaping war, weather challenges. They had like a kind of a mini ice age, which would have maybe pushed some of the tribes further south. So I don't necessarily just look at the tribes right around the Great Lakes where we think the Book of Mormon took place. Looking down into the southern, into Tennessee, into even over in Arizona, you're going to see some of those things because people travel. So the Cherokee have a lot of oral traditions. One of them describes carrying sacred objects into battle and winning wars because they carried the sacred items with them, comparable to like the Israel carrying the ark. Some ceremonies involved ritual purification and sacred fire, just like in the Levitical temple practices. The Choctaw traditions speak of a man named Nuah who was warned by the Great Spirit to build a boat to save his people from a great flood. How similar is that to the Bible story of Noah? There's an Indian legend that speaks of when all people were one tribe and tried to build a tower to get to heaven. Early missionaries in the 1600s claimed that Native Americans responded to Hebrew phrases like Shema Yisrael, which is like a call to worship. Hear, O Israel is what it means. And they would respond to that, like they knew what it meant, and they would respond in kind. So I mean, there's just so much out there, so much evidence out there to just blindly close our eyes and pretend like it's not real. It's just silly. But that's what I had. Next time we'll go into some of the DNA stuff, and then we'll get into language stuff, which is really fascinating.
That's from time to time you'll see a relic and they'll say, oh, this is a fraud, or this is a fake, but it's still hundreds of years ago. And when you think about, what's harder to believe, that people were making these fake things with real Hebrew inscriptions all over? And we're looking back before internet, before encyclopedia, before all of the information that we have now. Makes it even more unlikely, in my opinion, that there's some great impetus to try to show that there was, Hebrew culture here. What would motivate someone to do that, especially before all of the information age that we have now? And, even if you were going to play devil's advocate and say that Joseph or a group of men wrote the Book of Mormon, which when you actually look at the content of the gospel, to me is just absolutely impossible. But to say that, they put this conspiracy together, they wouldn't have all of this information, even going to the brass plates, even going to the golden plates, the stone box that they were found in, and all of these other evidences that now back up. Joseph, they would have had to hit every mark that would have been found later on in history, absolutely on the dot, right on the head. And to me, that's too much of a leap of faith to try to believe it was some conspiracy and they were right on all of these things now that we find, and even the story in the Book of Mormon. I don't know what you think. That's just a crazy leap, I think.
Yeah, what I've noticed too is that the people that have already decided that it can't be true will often shift their story. So, like for example, the gold plates. In the 1800s they said, "Oh, that's impossible. Nobody ever wrote on anything metal. That's just dumb." And now all of a sudden you got all this evidence. Well, so now the argument is, oh well, a book as big as the Book of Mormon could have never been written on gold plates. They acknowledge, okay, yeah, they wrote on gold plates, but still it couldn't be true. Because they're deciding ahead of time that it's not true, and therefore we're going to find a reason why it's not. And it kind of reminds me of talking to my teenage son. When he doesn't do his chores correctly, he always finds a reason why he's right and I'm wrong. Because he has an agenda. And
Right.
and I think we do that as human beings. We go into it thinking, well, I'm right, and I'm going to prove that I'm right, rather than going in and saying, Lord, what do you want me to know? How can I know you better? And I think that's part of the problem with some of our approach to all this stuff is that we've got to come unto Christ. Coming unto our human learning is just going to send us down some crazy rabbit hole. But if we come unto Christ, even if some of this stuff that we found that's we think is true, if it's not, that's fine. It doesn't affect our relationship with Christ. If we found out that the Decalogue stone or whatever was some guy came forward and said, yeah, it was me. I did it when I was a kid and whatever. It wouldn't change our relationship with Christ.
Right.
Hopefully it wouldn't. Hopefully it wouldn't. But I think that's the focus, is that how does this stuff confirm or reaffirm my faith in Christ? That's the most important thing.
Right. Yeah. When Corey began studying bringing out a lot of this Hebrew, and Jeff Brenner and other people that are now scholars of it, who aren't attached to Mormonism or Restoration or the Book of Mormon, he said, well, I feel like I'm kind of preaching to the choir because most of our listeners already believe in it. And unbeknownst to me, that years later, we'd start being involved with people from all over the country who are walking away from, quote, Mormonism or LDS or RLDS or Community of Christ. And they're giving up all of their beliefs. And as we find things in history that don't add up in our own church history, our own culture, with God and his scriptures, we begin to see that I think things like this that we discover are important so that people still believe in the gospel and they don't throw it all away. We didn't know that, there'd be such a mass exodus, and then people are leaving the gospel in the Book of Mormon because of the church. And these things do affirm my faith. It's not just trying to get people to believe the Book of Mormon is true. It's the gospel and the relationship. And it's just simple message of repentance and coming to Christ, as you said, Shane. It's so important, and it's so plain, and it gives us such a way to connect with our Creator and teach us about him. And to throw that away because of evil men and tampering with the gospel is a tragedy. And these things are faith affirming. Even if you already believe in the book, all the more reason to dive in and be connected to it, realizing it's a great gift from God. And those that don't maybe are seeing this, that don't know the story, we believe that Lehi, what it says in the Book of Mormon, was from the tribe of Manasseh, from Joseph, and that as the tribes were scattered, that this land was prophesied to be a land of freedom, and they were led away from time to time to be able to worship God and continue to be his covenant people. And so this is why we're doing this. This is a story of the Book of Mormon, and now we see that it wasn't just a fantasy of a young boy, if he even could have created it, which I just see no way he could have. That it's hitting all of these marks in so many ways. It's faith affirming. And so no matter how bad your traditions are in your religion, or how bad your church has corrupted the gospel of Jesus Christ, which it says in the Book of Mormon, don't add to these plain things. This is for your benefit. Don't add to my doctrine. That you can still be connected to your Savior. And that's what it's all about. Like Shane said, repenting and coming unto Christ and being saved in his kingdom and prepared to meet him. And I just think this is very helpful and practical. So I'm excited to continue to go through this, Shane, but this is remarkable stuff. You've done an excellent job of putting all this together. So thank you so much for the many, many hours that you've spent doing this.
And that's all I wanted to add was I'm so incredibly impressed at just the quality of your slides and the research and the way you present it. when I put something together for us, it's a Word document that I scroll through to keep on track. I just, all the work that you've done on your Book of Mormon podcast, you can just see how that's laid the groundwork to make you such a good presenter. And I just couldn't thank you enough for the quality of the stuff that you're putting out.
Yeah, every week in the notes, there's a link to Shane's channel, Restoration Believer. There's a link to Matt's channel, Mormon Rescue. And I just feel humbled that over the past few years, the Lord has brought brothers to me and brought us together, and that we're able to share this time together, every week. It's humbling to me, and I know God knew all along one day we'd be sitting here doing this, but I shared in it, and it's a blessing, and it's remarkable to me. So we're all in different states across the country, from the West Coast to the Eastern time, but here we are with a belief in the Book of Mormon, and most importantly, the gospel and the Creator that's presented in the Book of Mormon. Wonderful. Well, guys, we'll reconvene next week, and we'll pick up where we left off. Thank you, Shane. Remember, we are just walking each other home. Be kind.
See you later.